Wonderful. So welcome everyone. Thank you so much for joining us. Thank you so much for being into the space. That, as I said before, was the great Lauren Hill paying tribute to the great Nina Simone. And welcome, 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 welcome to our space. And welcome to a beautiful evening of learning. I'm excited about our research author speaker series. We have three presenters this evening. We have Dr. Stephanie Ferron, we have Dr. Kashka Watson, and Dr. Key Alexander, all persons of which I've worked with, commune with, be in relationship, community with, and looking forward to hear more about their studies. I'm very excited to hear about how, to learn from this space. I'm going to go with the land acknowledgement first, and then we're going to get right into it. So I want to take a moment to do the land acknowledgement and an ancestral acknowledgement. Let me share my screen. It's always good for us to have the visuals so people can see also what we do and to participate into that as well. So there we have it, everyone. I'm going to go from the land acknowledgement. So we wish to acknowledge this land on which the University of Toronto operates. For thousands of years, it has been the traditional land of the Huron-Wendat, the Seneca, and the Mississaugas of the Credit. Today, this meeting place is still home to many Indigenous people across Turtle Island, and we are grateful to have the opportunity to work on this land. And I'm sure all of us are coming from different spaces and places on this Turtle Island, and just to acknowledge that we are indeed on Indigenous land. We think about the conversation, the brave conversations that we must have. Today, I'm reminded that yesterday I was reminded we celebrated Thanksgiving in Canada. Thanksgiving means different things to different people. It was also Columbus Day to our neighbors next door. And what does that mean? And so we have to remember as we do the land acknowledgement, as we say them, as we perform them, to understand what we are doing. If not, I always say to people, if you're not authentic about what you are saying, I would always encourage us not to do it at all, because pretense is something that is very rampant in this work that we are doing. I also want to raise the ancestral acknowledgement. So we acknowledge the Indigenous Africans who were forcefully removed from their native lands and dispersed across the New World. This involuntary migration heavily contributed to the movement of African-descended people across the African diaspora to places like Canada. As students and learners, we deem it highly necessary to think deeper and examine the processes that led to the disposition of Indigenous peoples on this land and settler colonialism, stolen people on stolen land. In entering a conversation about anti-Black racism, it is important to center the humanity of Black children and Black families and to examine systems such as education system that act upon them. And this source comes from Natasha Henry, president of the Ontario Black History Society, educational consultant, and of course now professor at York University. I also want to just again say a special welcome. I see peeps coming into the room, other professors, and we want to just engage in a beautiful evening. Before I get into calling on Sarah, which is the GA for the CBSE, before I call on her to introduce our first speaker, which is Dr. Stephanie Ferron. And I'm just remind all our speakers that you will have speaker access to co-host accent, where you can share your screen as well. So that is going to be happening in a minute. So don't you worry, you can get your presentation ready and we'll do that. But before I do that, I want to take a quick minute, again, another quick minute to remind everyone, inform everyone of the Center for Black Studies in Education, the work that we are doing here at the center. I want to take your time to look at the screen at this time. This is our website. For those of you who have never been to our website, I trust and encourage you to do so, to stop there, to see what we're doing. especially looking at our Black faculty student research gathering. This is a very, very carefully curated space. And I must tell you that we had the first offering on October the 1st, engaging in critical research. Of course, I'm present as a CBSE director, but I'm also present as a student. I'm very, very careful to say that. In that space, I want to learn. And so I sat in the lecture, which I'm going to do in every single one of them. And I really walked away with so much about critical research coming from Professor Ann Lopez. But something I want to share with community. When I say to you, and you see me post a lot on social media, I talk about the ways in which we show up in community and the ways in which community is that basket that provides for us. I want us to understand the power in community. At this event, we had 19 graduate students present, myself, my 2GA, and Professor Ann Lopez. Before the night was out, I drove home. I left that building at about 8:20, something like that. Before I reached home, there was an email. There was one email before I reached home, and it moved me. It was from a participant who said this is her first time being in a space, first time with so many Black persons doing this kind of conversation. She was emotional. She sent me the most beautiful email. And it was not just about the research, it was about the space. She walked in, saw Black women and Black men having tea and coffee and persons and bodies and Black bodies laughing. She said, I heard the laugh from outside. She said, I came into the space and the food and the conversation. So I want you to understand when we create these spaces, I want to go on record on this recording to say this. I want people to understand this is why we create these spaces. These spaces are valuable spaces. These spaces are extremely valuable. Before the night was out, I got a second email, and that came from a doctoral student who is not a University of Toronto student, but doing her PhD at another institution. And she said, I don't have any of this where I'm at. And she said, can I attend all of them? We said, absolutely, you can. So those spaces when I said CBSE monthly faculty and student research gathering, it is a space for us to walk away more engaged, more aware, more challenged, but also being in community. There are many of us who could have done better in life if we had community. And so community is here for you. I want you to make sure you tell your friends and your persons who need community to show up. The last thing I want to share with you is our Black Faculty in Conversation series. It's under the resources. I must tell you something. I have had a number of persons reach out to me to tell me thanks because these are all available and they are free to use. So I've gotten emails where people are saying to me, Dr. Campbell, at our staff meeting today, we watched one of your Oisy Black Faculty in Conversation video. These are powerful. And for all the Black women in the space who want to have conversation with Black women, the 2024 offering was amazing. I want you to go back to the 2020 offering just before George Floyd and see what the conversation was like. And I want you to go to the 2021 when we are just into COVID to see what the conversation is like. And I just want to say thanks to persons like Professor Key Alexander, who is in the space or participated in these sessions before. So this is resources on our pages. And I can tell you, 2025 is going to be a vibe. 2025 is going to be a vibe. And so I just want to say thank you so much for that. I want to just join another minute to quickly add our speakers, just to pin them for a bit so you see who our speakers are for today. And I just want to say welcome to our speakers. You see us there on the stage. Well, I'm not the speaker. I'm going to move myself in a minute. It's going to be Professor Stephanie Farron. I love you, Stephanie. I appreciate you. I respect you. I admire you. Today, I was going through your bio, and I've totally just left the bio alone because I'm not going to read it. Somebody else is going to read it. And I went into your signature, and I just want to say, big up, enough respect. I see the work. I looked into your signature, and I see the research and the work. and I smile because this is what we need. We have to tell our stories. And a lot of us, we keep saying it, but we are not saying it. We are not doing it. And so I'm so excited to have you talk about the topics you're going to talk about. Professor Key Alexander, who is someone who I know everybody wants a piece of your minute. Everybody wants a piece of your hour. Everybody wants a piece of your break, your lunch, your coffee time. I know what my emails look like. I can just imagine what yours look like, and you show up. I want to say thanks to you, Key, for showing up. You're never a last minute show up. When I send out messages, and this is for the recording, you show up because your voice is so distinct, talking about queer and trans and Black queer and trans information. I want to share something very personal before I move on to our next speaker, because I'm a storyteller and I believe in sharing stories. In 2009, when I came to University of Toronto, 2009, to do my PhD. In 2011, I was doing my PhD, working, teaching part-time, working, and I got an invite to go to Atlanta by Professor Lance McCready to attend a Black LGBTQ space. I was just starting to do my research and studies and understand who I was as a Black queer person, Black gay man. And he said to me, you should really attend this conference. I was a PhD student at that time, not even a doctoral candidate. It was in Atlanta. And I never forget, I was so excited to go. But when I realized I couldn't afford to go to that conference, I couldn't. 2010, I could not. Now I've been to many conferences I pay on my own, and conference supported by the university. And so when I say to people, I want the CBSE to be that space, that place to support these things, support. I have a dream. It's going to happen where you are going to help me to make this happen, where Black community, Black doctoral student, Black grad students travel together to attend these conferences out of Canada into Black spaces like Atlanta and the Caribbean and Africa and the continental Africa to do our research and to exchange knowledge. It's gonna happen, and I'm speaking it into being, because I know for myself that wasn't a reality when I was a grad student. And so the last person we see here is Professor Kachka Watson from Brock, who is also a University of Toronto or is a graduate, and we're going to get right into it. So thank you so much. Thank you so much. Thank you so much. I'm going to leave you pinned there, Stephanie, because you are our first speaker, and I'm going to be inviting Sarah, who is a GA for the CBSE, to join us and welcome you and read your bio for us. It's important that we read our bios. Absolutely important.
Well, it's an honor to be able to not only see the lovely faces here, but be able to read out Dr. Farron's bio. So without further ado, let me introduce Dr. Farron. So Dr. Stephanie Farron joins from York University's Faculty of Education as the inaugural Assistant Professor of Black Thriving in Education. Her research draws on Black storytelling traditions to explore the ways that Black mothers and educational institutions partner to support Black student well-being. Dr. Stephanie uses literature and visual arts to communicate in a more of a structured, creative, and accessible form, which provides insights gleaned from stories shared by Black mothers and their families. Professor Farron, her publications have appeared in several scholarly journals, including Canadian Journal for the Study of Adult Education, Canadian Review of Sociology. Dr. Farron has worked nearly 15 years in public education systems, assuming leadership positions in France, Guadeloupe, and Canada. Most recently, she was the program coordinator for the Equity, Anti-Racism, and Anti-Oppression team and the Model Schools for Inner Cities Department at the TDSB. In this role, Stephanie provided leadership to administrators and system leaders in implementing policies and practices that promote student academic achievement, well-being, and belonging in schools. So without further ado, I will now introduce Dr. Stephanie Farron.
Thank you so much for that introduction. And as I get my PowerPoint set up, I also want to introduce into the space Terry-Ann Groves. She is my community research assistant, and there's a certain part in the presentation where she's going to help me present.
Hello, everyone. Good evening.
Good evening. Welcome. Thank you for bringing community voice in the space, Stephanie. This is why I love you. This is a power that you're coming in, inviting community voice in this space. This is it.
So as I start, or before I start, I also want to center both Terry-Ann as well as myself. We are both proud Black mamas of 2 children. I have a boy and a daughter, 3 and 6 years old, and Terry-Ann also has 2 boys of her own. So I really want to center just our mother identity for this presentation. So my presentation is really based upon my most recent publication, which is entitled Black Mother Scholars Redefining Scholarly Inquiry Through Black Artistic Expression. And for this presentation, I'm going to explore Black art in Canada, situating it within Black Mother Scholars research traditions. I'm going to also reflect on how a group of Black mother learners and I use Black artistic expression to develop a subversive form of scholarly inquiry. I'm also going to highlight the possibilities and limitations of using Black art to integrate activism into research. And I will conclude this presentation by really talking about a series of reflection questions that are really geared to challenge all of us to engage in educational research as an act of artistic as well as liberatory labor. So what is this thing called Black Canadian art? How am I imagining Black Canadian art? I refute claims of Black Canadian art as solely involving the excavation and retrieval of Black oppression. Much like Walcott and McKittrick, I do not limit Black art to themes of Black Canadians' absented presence, that is, our invisibility and our simultaneous hypervisibility in this country. Rather, I conceptualize Black Canadian art as a creative work that explores and uncovers the ways that we Black people, especially Black mothers, explore and uncover and navigate life as being Black, not defined only by racist logics and processes of disavowal. You see, Black art for me offers us other possibilities for imagining and living Blackness in Canada. Black Canadian art expresses the complexity of Blackness, allowing Black identities, as Fatona says, to emerge and reemerge in the aftermath of slavery. That is state-sanctioned violence, exclusion, and subjugation. Ultimately, Black Canadian art serves as a creative site for Black people to validate our experiences, as well as to engage in dialogue, conversation, debates, and even, of course, Black refusal. Black mother scholars enjoy a long tradition of grounding educational research in Black art. For example, educational researchers like Dr. Honora presents her conversations with 8 Black Canadian mothers living here in Toronto as a series of creative nonfiction short stories. The stories are interlaced with personal accounts and folklore. Honora upholds her reliance on the art of storytelling for research, noting Black people's longstanding use of stories to articulate our cultural values, histories, and even our ancestral memory. Askai is a celebrated early childhood educational scholar whose research profile includes examining Black children's maternal relationships. And much like Honora's work, Askai uses Black vernaculars to tell the story of intergenerational mothering. In so doing, Askai prioritizes Black readers, bringing to the public sphere what Morrison calls discounted knowledge. So I'm presenting this paper, my most recent publication, to you all. And I'm doing so not necessarily to reimagine, not necessarily to abandon the canon of educational research, but instead I do so because I'm struggling to remake it into spaces where Black mothers like myself revel in the possibilities of our art as vigorous scholarship and activism. For real, I'm just imagining educational research as a form of activism. Walcott maintains that a robust culture of critique is crucial to the making of Black Canadian art and scholarship. And for this, I extend Walcott's insistence of critique onto my own work as an arts-informed researcher and Black mother scholar. In this paper, I critically reflect on my own creative practice with Black mothers living in Canada, and I engage in this reflexive practice to further archive Black art and its related knowledges, practices, and engagements as pivotal to Black communities' use of educational research for social transformation. So this autoethnographic paper is guided by the following question. How do Black mother scholars use Black art to reimagine education research as activism? I draw on a power-conscious framework in Dillard's and darkened feminist epistemology to respond to this question. So this study relied on the creative nonfiction story, Mint, Tea, and Comic Books. And this is a short story that I published in the Canadian Review of Sociology. And it's from the article At Mummy's Feet. And if you use the QR code, you'll be able to access it. And I wrote this story to document an early research experience working with 4 Black mother learners. And the data-driven short story uses information gleaned from in-depth, semi-structured interviews with participants and my personal notes. And the story features the characters Dr. Branford and a research participant named Gloria, who is a Black mother learner. In the story, I am reimagined as Dr. Branford, the study's principal investigator, while Terry Ann will be reimagined as Gloria, one of the research participants. So presenting my research practice as a short story in this way, which we'll read to you, allowed me to enter a dialogic exercise with my earlier self and participants. So if you want to follow along, use the QR code, and I believe it starts at page 328 and 329. I'm going to stop sharing for a minute. Terry Ann, I hope you're ready.
I am ready.
Okay. So this is the short story, Mint, Tea, and Comic Books. On a Tuesday evening in November, Gloria and 3 of her Black mothers and 3 other Black mothers filed into the church recreation room. The woman huddled at a table lined with cups of tea. Gloria slumped into a chair, hunched over the hot drinks, and grabbed a glass mug. Steam from the mint tea circled behind her nose and grazed the tapered fro. Dr. Branford, a local researcher, tucked a trio of braids behind her ears and settled into the chair across from Gloria. The researcher planted her arms on the table. Both the table and Dr. Branford were caramel with hints of yellow. Her dark coils covered her phone and grazed the collar of her made in Jamaica sweater. Blaring horns screeched, brakes, and other ruckus from the rush hour traffic seeped through the closed window and spilled into the room. Dr. Branford, thanks for agreeing to be part of my research study.
I've seen you help out at our reading program a few times. Plus, Phyllis vouched for you. You're good people.
I'm glad I have a good reputation around here.
I do feel comfortable around you, at least enough to share my stories with you.
Your stories are important.
In this program, it took me a while to even feel safe to write and talk about my life. To trust you with my stories is a big deal.
You bring and the other Black mothers share in the study are going to help shift how academia understands adult literacy.
You know, I ain't doing this for the study for those people up in those fancy universities.
Who are you doing it for?
We're doing it for our children and even other Black mothers. At least I am.
I get it. I get it. I'm a Black mama too.
When you told us that the final report will be like a comic book, I knew this was something I could do.
I really want the report to be accessible for Black mamas, especially those in adult literacy programs. Phyllis came up with this whole idea of a comic book and even found a local artist to work with us on the images.
I'm not the best reader, but I can figure out a comic book. My sister friend Daisy, who stays in the apartment across the hall, is going to be able to understand the report. My teenage son, too. He's still trying to figure out this reading thing. This will help him and Daisy to their goals.
The point of us doing this work.
I see other researchers buzzing around the neighborhood. They're not even from here.
Lots of people are interested in studying the Black experience in Toronto.
The other mothers and I talked about it the other day. No more letting these outsiders just take from us and get famous off our stories.
I hear you. That's why I'm working with Phyllis to make sure the study is done right.
I respect the way you're moving with this study. You're getting guidance from the right people.
Thank you. I really am trying.
We want to be a part of the conversation, not just the topic of it. More times after the study interviews, we never see the researchers or the final report. People have a way of disappearing on us.
You and the mothers have a right to engage in research, especially if it's about you.
I know that, but I've seen a lot of researchers move like I'm not smart enough or interested enough in this thing they call research.
We already have a few other adult literacy programs committed to using the final report as a mentor text.
Yep, Phyllis already done put it in our schedule. We're going to read the whole report together as a class.
Dr. Branford nodded and grinned, revealing a set of dimples. Gloria closed her eyes, raised the mug of tea to her lips, and took a sip. The 54A barreled down the avenue just outside the church, muting a cackle from the three other mothers now grouped around Phyllis and the window. I'm now going to share back my presentation. Thank you, Terry Ann, for helping out. So there are some themes that were revealed, and I'm only going to speak about one theme, and the other themes, you have to read the article. So theme one really centers this idea of story listening, storytelling, and Black refusal. In this story, I informed Gloria of the benefits of sharing Black maternal stories with scholars, highlighting academia as the intended audience for the report. Gloria counters and insists that her stories are for members of her kinship network. I worked with a local artist and even 4 community advisors who were arts leaders, educators, workers in the community. As captured in the story, I structured this early study to affirm Black mothers as legitimate knowledge producers and storytellers within academia. While I focused on repositioning participants as legitimate knowledge holders within academic spheres, I unfortunately de-emphasized the role of the story listener. Participants refused to create a report that prioritized the needs, abilities, and understandings of academics residing outside their community. Participants enforced their agency to redefine the intended story listener as their own children and fellow Black mother learners. This refocus of the story listener was critical to the participants, asserting that their children and fellow Black mother learners would be able to fully decode their stories and find meaning in them. The mothers articulated that the purpose of their stories was actually to help their children and Black mothers in their neighborhood achieve their own reading goals. To further solidify their children and other Black mother learners as their true audience, participants used Black vernaculars, imagery, expressions, and references that were accessible to those within their kin networks. The mothers insisted on the inclusion of these Black-coded mechanisms in the study's final report, which turned out to be a comic book. In doing so, Black mother learners engaged in the radical act of Black refusal, a rejection of status quo as livable and the creation of possibility in the face of negation. My initial centering of academics in the study disregarded the ways that dominant research processes found in academia render Black people as fundamentally as outsiders and unintelligible. Through participants' acts of refusal, I remembered that grounding inquiry in Black art provides opportunities to subvert anti-Black formations in educational research and practice. With participants, I embraced the central roles of Black storytellers, Black story listeners, and Black refusal in reimagining inquiry as a generative and creative process in affirming Black maternal life. Theme 2, which I will not go into in depth because of time, is all about the ways that Black art requires Black mother scholars like myself to address power differentials inherent in the inquiry process. So feel free to use the QR code and to access the article and to read more about theme 2. So I conclude this reflexive paper with an offering to educational researchers, academics, activists, and students who center Black mothers and Black art in their work. I challenge these scholars, us all actually, and change makers to reflect on the following questions. How might the arts offer authentic opportunities for research participants to contribute to decision-making processes? What systems are set up in our inquiry processes to solicit and act on participant input and artistic wonderings? And what ways might we leverage the arts to produce scholarship that refuses the confines of anti-Blackness? And if y'all are curious to see how the comic book turned out, again, you can use this QR code and you'll have access to the comic book that we created, Black Mother Learners and I. Thank you so much, everyone, for listening to just about my recent publication and some of the research that I'm passionate about.
Wow. Thank you so much, Professor Farron. Can we put your hands together, please? Big up, big up, big up, big up. I want to say this. I'm teaching a course, Professor Farron, and CTL 5708, a couple of the students are here. One of the students who introduced is one of the students. I guarantee you, and I saw another one of my students, Allison Parsons, taking notes. I guarantee you that you just covered a beautiful part of my lecture that we talked about just the other day. Talking about how do we enter into community spaces to do work, our kind of research, and what does that look like? And I hope the students, especially in my class, listen to the script. I listen to every word, and I'm going to make sure they got a copy from the QR code of what the dialogue looked like and how we build trust. And the reason why in the comic strip, in the research, that the researcher played such a role of what I consider to be cultural humility. Understanding that you are taking information from someone of community and that the person in the community demanded how their information was to be used. But the second thing I want to point out is something that resonated with me. I was like, wow, let me write that down on my notes. So I did it on my notes. when you said we decenter the listener, I got chills. Powerful. I'm sure I'm going to have lunch or coffee or something with you. So one of these days I could hear some more about that, about decentering the listener. That's some powerful stuff. Thank you so much. We're going to take one question from the audience. I want that level of engagement. Is there one person who have a question for, I'm going to take one question for Professor Farron, then we move on to our next presenter. Do you use a raise an icon so I could see you? One question for Professor Farron. I know we have maybe a number of questions, but we'll take one. Who want to go first? Can use the raise an icon. Please use the raise an icon so I could see you. Otherwise, I won't get to see you. No one for now. Okay, that's fine. Professor Friend, I do have a question. I see Alice, Alyssa. Alyssa, I'm going to take your question, then I'm going to go with my question afterwards. Alyssa, can you turn on your mic? You're allowed to turn on your mic.
Sure.
Go ahead.
Professor Farron, where do you plan to take the research next with regards to Black art and accessing Black art as a way to, just speak more about the experiences of Black mothers?
Thank you for the question. Right now, traditionally, my work has centered on arts-informed research. So arts-informed research really is the way that I present research findings. As you could see, I present it in an artistic way. Sometimes it's a visual, sometimes it's a graphic novel, sometimes it's just a written short story, but it's always grounded in Black art. Now my research is taking me into arts-based research, which is really engaging participants in Black art to create knowledge, to engage in knowledge creation through the arts together. And as always, I stand firm in my practice as an arts-informed researcher, so findings will always be expressed using Black art. And now the next step for me is actually authentically engaging participants, Black mothers, in the creation process using Black art. So that's my next step, is really engaging participants in an authentic way in the knowledge creation process through Black art, as well as presenting it using Black art.
Wow. Thank you. Wow. We're learning. I hope everybody's realizing and learning. And this is the power that I wanted into the space where we realize that knowledge should and can be shared. Professor, here's my question, Professor Furnace. It's almost the same as the first question. Do you get pushback? Well, that's a silly question to ask if you get pushback. How do you deal with the pushback when you are so amazing and intentional about the ways in which and I noticed you said twice in that response that this is how I will present my finding. When you get that pushback about how you present your finding, that's not the usual way and this not the standard, because of course the standard is created by a certain body. What is your response when you hear that criticism, that critique and criticism?
I take two steps, really. So Black art tells me that I have to be intentional about identifying who my audience is, who my story listeners are. When I ground myself in understanding that my true ultimate story listener are fellow Black mothers, it really makes it clear what steps I am going to take and what I have to take to ensure that my story listeners can appreciate my art, appreciate the research that I'm using art as one mode of expression. The other thing that I'm really intentional about is where I present my work as well as where I publish my work. I make sure that the journals, the editors are all grounded in this idea of Black art is research, research is art, especially when we're grounding it in Black epistemologies. And I find that in one hand, it might limit my reach, as in journals that I could publish in. And on the other hand, it shows how intentional I am about who my story listeners are. And because I'm guided by how I conceptualize Black art, it makes it clear for me. And it allows me to, yes, hear the criticism, because like I said, part of Black art is to engage in this fulsome critique. And it also requires me to, yes, hear the criticism, hear the critique, and it also really steers me saying, I am grounded in Black mothers, and this is who my research is ultimately for, and I am good for that. And that's how I move through it.
I am grounded. That's it. Thank you so much. Professor Farron, thank you. Thank you. You started this session with a fire that our community wants to learn from, because I know for a fact that there are many Black scholars who are struggling to be as grounded as you are. They are
And
struggling to be this grounded.
Dr. ABC, before I turn it over to the next speaker, I also want to say is that I'm intentional on pretty much every presentation that I have done about it is I bring a Black mother into the space from community. And I ensure that on my research team, I have a community member who is a Black mother, not connected to an academic institution, who's being compensated as an expert for their knowledge and their experience. And for today, it is Terry-Ann Groves, who is my co-presenter, and also really further centering Black mothers and really reminding me constantly that my ultimate audience is actually her, my fellow Black mother.
Thank you.
Yes.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. What you just said, I needed that reminder as well. Because as I said, I'm having conversation with people, but every now and then, you have conversation with yourself. And I'm very proud of the way that I'm grounding my work. And every now and then, when I push back, I walk away satisfied with the pushback because of the intentionality. And a lot of us do need to learn, especially when we are pressured by institutions, do need to learn how to walk in our research with intentionality. Thank you, thank you, thank you. Thank you. Big up, enough love. We are now going to be joined by Dr. Kashka Watson, and we're going to invite one of our amazing volunteer from the center, Ashea, who is also one of our past students as well from OISE, and now is one of our CBSE center volunteer, to introduce Dr. Kashka Watson. Go ahead, Ashea.
Hi, thank you. And thank you, Dr. Farron, and thank you, Terry-Ann. That was a very beautiful start to this. It felt very empowering as well. So to continue our evening with community and empowerment, please join me in welcoming Dr. Kashka R. Watson, pronouns he, him, who is an assistant professor of administration, leadership, and policy in the Faculty of Education in the Department of Educational Studies at Brock University. His research interests include anti-Black racism, anti-oppression education, equity, diversity, inclusion, and social justice studies, administration, leadership, and policy, Black 2S LGBTQIA identities, racialized students' experiences in K-12 and higher education, culturally relevant and sustainable leadership in Canadian schools and universities. His scholarly works include journal publications, chapters in edited books, and magazine articles. He has written courses at the school board, college, and at university levels. He enjoys gardening and nature, watching movies, fashion, socializing with friends, and cooking. So please give a warm welcome to Dr. Watson.
Thank you so much, Ashea. Can you all hear me?
Yes.
Excellent. So I'm going to be sharing my screen and then we're going to move right into our presentation. Okay, can you see my screen?
Yes, we can.
Excellent. Okay, so good evening, everyone. My name is Dr. Kashka Watson, and I'm happy to be here to talk to you about my research. And thank you so much, Dr. Farron, for that wonderful research. It's really great hearing about Black mothers and art in the research space. So thank you so much for that. So my presentation this evening is about duoethnography, truth-telling differences and commonalities in the experiences of two same-gender loving Black men in academia. Before I get started, I wanted to share that this particular research it was created by myself and Dr. Andrew Campbell, DR.ABC, and we presented this, well, he presented this research. I was unable to attend at the Jamaican third biannual conference, Beyond Homophobia Conference, January of this year. And so we got great feedback. This work is also in the process. It's going under review to be published as a chapter in a book that has been accepted. And also from this work, we have nuanced the research. We have nuanced the research and also conducted another duoethnography study that is now under review to be published in a journal as well. So I just wanted to share that as well. This is also in response to one of the participants' response to Dr. Farron in terms of where is she taking her research next and the status of it as well. So without further ado, we move into the introduction. So same-gender loving Black men have been experiencing challenges in academia because of their sexuality, and many of them have faced vulnerabilities because of their sexuality. And we found in the research that many same-gender loving Black males in academia, focusing on Black faculty, many of them feel like their livelihoods and career paths have been threatened, primarily due to perhaps students' evaluation feedback, as well as performance feedback from their direct supervisors within academic spaces. And so one of the reasons why we came together to do this research is to really shed light on the disparities that are happening among same-gender loving Black males in academia, and wanted to create a space where we can share our stories so that other same-gender loving Black males can see our stories and learn from them and interject their own stories into ours, and to see how best they can navigate the space in academia. Because oftentimes when our stories are told, it's being told from others' perspective and not coming directly from us. And so we felt the need to create that space where we are the ones driving that narrative and sharing our stories. So how do we come to this work in terms of our positionality? So I'll start with DR.ABC first. So DR.ABC shows up in his work as his authentic self, as you all know. He's also Jamaican, he's also Canadian by legal agreement. DR.ABC has completed his primary and secondary education in Jamaica, as well as his teacher education in Jamaica as well. He has been made to feel invisible because of his sexual orientation, and he continues to experience and witness some of these challenges right here in Canada in the academic space. That's my auto light turning off by itself. So for me, I come to academia and to the space as a Black LGBTQ gay man. I've experienced bullying in primary school and secondary school in Jamaica. I've watched some of my peers undergo extreme bullying and violent attacks being leveled at them during my education experience in Jamaica. And so because of all these experiences that I've witnessed, and both from a personal lens from my own self, as well as what I've seen happening around with my peers, it has really drawn me to focus on work that really centers on individuals who are discriminated against, individuals who are underrepresented and often marginalized, not just in academia, but in society on a broad level. So my lived experiences have really ignited my passion for championing anti-Black racism, diversity, and equity, as O'Shea mentioned in my biography, as well as focusing on marginalized students, as well as towards LGBTQIA+ peoples within the academic space. And so this is how we position ourselves in our research, and our research focus on duoethnography. So why did we choose duoethnography? And I want to make the point what Dr. Ferron mentioned in her research in that dialogue reading that happened between she and Terrian, where the mother, who Terrian is replicating in that research, is wanting to find out how the information that is going to be shared is going to be portrayed in terms of put out there, and the comfortableness, and whether or not they can trust the researcher, who is in that case is Dr. Ferron. And I think that is a key aspect in research, especially when you go into communities, when you're doing research within communities and you're trying to get information to publish or to put out there. The community has to make sure that they can trust you as a researcher. And so when it comes to doing duoethnography, a lot of that, the foundation of that is really built on trust and respect between the two researchers, in this case, myself and Dr. ABC. And so if that trust is not there, if that foundation is not there, then it's going to be challenging for us to be vulnerable. It's going to be challenging for us to be truly authentic when we share our stories. And it's going to be challenging for us to really have a rich and fruitful discussion as we engage in that. And so to set the tone, I've known Dr. ABC for over 16 years. We're both from Jamaica, and we're both Jamaican and Canadian. We both attended the same high school in Jamaica, but at different times. And it's an all-boys school as well. We have both championed and supported each other and watched each other grow, both individually and professionally. We have also worked collaboratively together on several projects that includes chapters in books. We have just finished working on an edited book, and we're working on a journal which this will be published in as well too. So we have worked on several projects, and we have also built community here in Canada, where we create that space for other 2S LGBTQIA+ people to be a part of that community and to share their experiences and to feel supported. And so why am I saying all of this? Because for us to engage in effective duoethnography, we have to have that foundation of friendship. And so our foundation of friendship is built on respect and trust, and that is a key foundation to have duoethnography to be successful. And so according to Sawyer and Norris, a duoethnographic qualitative methodological approach really amalgamates diverse elements of reflective inquiry that involve autoethnography, autobiography, self-study, and the individual's life histories and stories, in this case, myself and Dr. Campbell. And duoethnographers often interrogate the cultural context of autobiographical experiences with issues relating to personal and professional identities. And so, as I mentioned, without trust in doing duoethnography, then the discourse is withheld in terms of we're unable to fully immerse ourselves into that dialogic experience that we're having in terms of recalling our past experiences growing up in homophobic Jamaica, attending high school where we were both bullied and experienced a lot of homophobic threats and sometimes violence being leveled at us. And so think about it, if you are unable to have that relationship with someone when you're doing this type of work that is very intimate, it's very personal, it really evokes a lot of emotions and a lot of past memories that have occurred in both our lives. If you're unable to trust someone, you're not going to be able to be open enough to release some of those experiences and to share those deeper stories that we're having. So trust is key. Respect is key as well. And so because of our existing relationship, as we're engaging in this duoethnographic methodological process, we learn more about each other. And so we tend to open up more in our discussions when we're sharing our stories about particular issues that we're talking about, which I'm going to get into the next slide. And so we listen to each other more, and the more we listen, the more we digest our respective and individual stories, and the more we're able to make connections from those stories, whether those connections are similar or different in nature, but we're able to pinpoint areas that we can both relate from our experiences. So duoethnography as a qualitative method is very specific, it's very personal, it's very intimate, and it really builds on trust and respect for both partners. And so as researchers together in a collaborative space, we juxtapose our voices in terms of disrupting and untangling meanings about our own experiences as same gender Black male in academia. And as I mentioned before, because we're comfortably enough with each other and because of our friendship and the bond that we have created, we're in a brave and safe space. So we were able to be more vulnerable with each other as we're recalling our stories and sharing them between each other. So doing duoethnography, in terms of the approach that we took, we engaged in about 4 dialogic Zoom meetings, each lasting about an hour over a period of 4 months. And I also want to point out that even before these scheduled meetings that we have, we communicated via WhatsApp text messages, over the phone to share initial thoughts and a particular research questions that we're going to be tackling as it relates to our scheduled meeting, as well as we talk about some initial memories that we experienced leading up to our scheduled meeting. Each meeting focused on guiding research questions. We chose guiding research questions just to keep us on track, to make sure that whatever stories we're recollecting and remembering, we're focused on that and looking back at those past experiences to keep us on track. And so we have some guiding questions that we use to support us in each of those 4 scheduled meetings. And those questions were centered around topics, broad topics of how do we come to academic spaces as same-gender loving Black males? What are some of the challenges and rewards that we experience in those spaces? How authentic are we in those spaces, and what kind of supports do we get in those academic spaces? And all our meetings were recorded via Zoom. They were transcribed and discussed between us as we maintain contact, constant interaction with the data being discussed. I also want to share that as we discuss each research question, we also ask each other prompting and probing questions as well. So for example, I might be sharing a particular experience that happened in school, and Dr. Cameron might say, but how did that experience make you feel, Dr. Watson, at that specific moment? And so we would elaborate on those different experiencing and capturing those rich data information in terms of a dialogic experience. We also immersed ourselves in the analysis process through deep introspection and reflexive practice. And that was an example of reflexive practice that I gave earlier on. We're not just reflecting on past experiences. As we're doing that, we're engaging in reflexive practice. So we are looking at what's happened in our respective stories and how did we deal with the situation in the moment at that particular time, or are we going deeper into those conversations that we're having openly amongst each other. We also reflected and examined the themes that emerge from those dialogic discussions that we have, and we use ourselves as a site of research and not necessarily focusing on the topic, but using our own personal lived experiences as a site of conducting this research. So we also engage in a curatorial type of method where we engage in self-interrogation. So as we're unpacking our past histories and stories, we're also repacking the meanings that comes from those stories as well. So it's really centering our experiences and getting that dialogic experience amongst us and looking to see where there are areas of similarities and differences in our respective discussions that we've had. And so from that, I won't go in depth with all of these themes, but from those rich discussions that we've had, 4 major themes emerge from that. They include entering academic spaces as same-gender loving Black males, examples that shape us as same-gender loving Black men in academia, and how do we show up in academic spaces as our full and authentic self? What does that look like? And what are some of the challenges and rewards of being a same-gender loving Black male in higher education? And so we discuss those individually as we present these themes. So for DR.ABC, in terms of entering academic spaces, it's about advocacy. He sees advocacy as being a crucial part of his academic space. He also spoke about not doing the soft life that is often said in Ghana, which is a life that is filled with comfort and relaxation, free from any burden or stress. And as same-gender loving Black males in academia, we can't live that soft life because we're constantly being put there and we're constantly being critiqued and discriminated against. So there's no soft life for us. Dr. Campbell also spoke about understanding that when we enter academic spaces, we're entering those spaces that are unsafe. And for him, one of his intentional action is to engage in mentorship, where he's providing that space where other same-gender loving Black males can benefit from that mentorship experience. As for me, I enter the academic space knowing that I will be viewed as othered because I'm gay and because of my sexuality. I also come to the academic space with my own stories and lived experiences, which help to shape who I am today. So as a same-gender loving Black male in academia, I take on issues that pertains to other underrepresented and racialized group and acting somewhat of an advocate on behalf of these groups in terms of advocating for them through my research, through my writing, through my leadership. And so this is how I enter the academic space, knowing who I am and creating space for that. In terms of the other theme, examples that help shape who we are as same-gender loving Black male in academia. For DR.ABC, he spoke about fear and flight. So given that we're in homophobic Jamaica, with the bullying and the homophobia that is happening. Is he going to be able to stay and challenge that narrative, or is he going to leave the country? And so Focus and Fight has a lot to do with his experience when he comes to Canada. And living here in Canada, he realized that his Blackness was now at the center of the discrimination that he faced, and not necessarily his sexuality in that respect. And so Forward and Fabulous is really looking at the resistance and the resilience of being gay and Black within academia here in Canada. For me, it's really looking at my advocacy, as I mentioned, through my research and through my writing, and really taking on opportunities just like this, coming to spaces like this, where I can share my story, where I can create that space where others who might have a similar story or not are able to learn from this experience as well. And so it's really taking on issues that tends to further marginalize individuals who are considered othered, and really focusing on the 2S LGBTQIA+ community in academic spaces as well. And then the other team is the challenges and rewards that we face or experience in higher education. And for Dr. Campbell is really continuing to resist and challenge inequities in higher education, and being committed to being his full and authentic self in academia, and constantly disrupting deficit thinking in all its forms. For me, this is a major challenge that I find. Oftentimes, I'm a little bit not so sure in terms of the level or the type of discrimination that I'm facing, whether it have anything to do with my Blackness or the fact that I'm gay. Sometimes I can't really tell, and I'm sure others might experience this particular example as well. But for me, in terms of a reward in academic spaces, it's really having that privilege to challenge heteronormativity and heterosexism, and to give voice to the voiceless through my stories, the stories that I share, and to engage in collaborative practice. I enjoy working collaboratively, whether it's with DR.ABC or with other colleagues, addressing social justice issues that affects underrepresented and marginalized groups in academia. So really tackling those issues and putting a voice out there so that others can grow and benefit from my experience. And then the last theme is really showing up in academic spaces as our full and authentic self. And what that looks like, it's really understanding who we are as individuals, and really coming to terms with one's identity, and using that to help guide your decisions in terms of how you navigate academic spaces. And for me, it's knowing that I have dealt with my own internalized homophobia as a young man growing up in Jamaica, going through high school and facing those bullies. And so now, speaking to you right here now, today, I am stronger, I am braver, I know exactly who I am, and so it doesn't bother me anymore what people say about me. I am living my own truth, and I'm doing things and advocating on issues that will produce more knowledge in this area, so that others can learn and grow from this experience. And finally, in terms of recommendations from this study, we realized that there needs to be more increased Black representation, which is often a challenge that we're experiencing in academia, particularly as it relates to same gender-loving Black males in academia, both at the faculty, student, and staff level, and so creating more spaces for opportunities to have more representation across the board for these individuals. The other piece is more opportunities for research and knowledge mobilization. And oftentimes in academia, the resources are so limited, and so Black faculty in particularly are pinned against each other to compete for these resources. So it's creating those spaces, getting the university to create those spaces where there's more resources so that everyone can benefit equitably. And then the third piece is fostering braver and safer spaces in higher education. And how do we do that? We work collaboratively through allyships with the institution itself to ensure that we're creating those safe and brave spaces for Black educators, and particularly Black same-gender loving Black males in academia. And the final point is nurturing Black healing and joy. And that really has a lot to do with supporting Black gay men in academia, and ensuring that we're not talking about or bringing up issues that will further traumatize them or bring up pain, but really creating that space where they feel safe enough to share their own stories and not have someone or some entity sharing those experiences for them, and really allowing them to tell their stories where they are able to flourish as Black men in their own identities and in their Black joy. And so this is our current research that we're pushing and working on, and really proud of this research, because for me in particularly, this is the first time that I'm really speaking about my sexuality in this way, and engaging more about it in this space as well.
Thank you so much, Dr. Watson. You can stop sharing your screen, and I will join you on screen for one quick question. And then, of course, I will turn over and welcome Mohammed and Professor Key Alexander to the space. And as you were talking about research, if you notice, Professor Watson spent a lot of time on the methodology, because I wanted, of course, we have students here from LHAE, we have students here from CTL, and we have from CTL a course that I'm doing. So we have students here from different classes, and also other students who are doing their masters. I see other master's students and doctoral students from other spaces. And so I know when you come to these spaces, the methodology is important. I noticed a question that was asked by Sarah to Stephanie, and Stephanie answered in the chat. Absolutely good, because I was also curious about that. So very good question there, Sarah, because we definitely want to understand what method we are using, but how we expand on these methods, how we marry these methods. But I also want you to note the last statement, which I didn't know he was going to share, that this is a new work to Dr. Watson. I've written my first book on towards LGBTQI issues, published from 2015. So it's been a while that I've been doing this, and Dr. Watson, we have had some intentional conversation. What you can see is that research, as Dr. Farron talked about, as in power, research as shown up in community, research as in grounding community's voice. Well, this is also research that is healing, research that addresses our personal trauma. And when we get the article published, we're working on a review of that article. We'll talk intentionally, a little bit more intentional about what happened in those conversations, because that is what the power wins. So when you walk away from a piece like this, and you know you have done the writing and the publishing, but does your research allow you to do the work and the growth and the joy and the passion and those things that make you go forward, because it's healing? So in my question to you then, Dr. Watson, I want you to take another minute, and we're going to move on. We have to move on. Just 1 minute to share what was that like as research. I would title it research as healing. what was that like for you personally as you engaged in the research, but also felt you're engaged in your own healing? What was that about?
Yeah, thank you so much for that question. I think to your point just now, you mentioned about the experience and how that make you feel. So for example, for me, there was an instance in our dialogic conversation between myself and Dr. Campbell where he asked me a question about how did my family receive me as being gay and being married and all of that. And unlike many gay men in Jamaica whose family tend to reject them. This is not the case for all, but for a lot of them, and shun them and disown them. My family did not do that, and which I myself was surprised. And the fact that they were so receptive and accepting of me as their child, as their son, as their brother, I broke down. I broke down when Dr. Campbell asked me that question, and I started crying because many gay men in Jamaica and in other Caribbean countries and in other spaces did not have this experience that I had. And so that really was a form of healing for me in that moment. And it was also a form of affirmation in terms of knowing that there is beyond homophobia that exists that we can get to. Yes, it's going to take a lot of work, but there is light at the tunnel, if you want to use those terms, that not all of our experiences are the same, and we have our own stories to tell, and they differ. There are some similarities, but they differ, and they provide that healing for all of us.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much. Put your hands together for that. Thank you so much. We are now going to move on to Professor Key Alexander. I smile. I see you, Key. I see you. I see you. I see you. And we're going to ask at this time that Mohammed, who is our incoming GA for the CBSE in January, we're going to have you, Mohammed, to introduce Dr. Key Alexander, as Dr. Key Alexander is going to focus on giving Black trans life, creating spaces for radical study in and beyond the university. Mohammed, over to you for the introduction.
Thank you very much. You kind of did my job just a little bit there, but a slight introduction, but no worries. First, I want to say hello, everyone. I would like to thank everyone here, specifically Dr. ABC, for inviting me into this space and having the opportunity to listen to Dr. Fearon and Dr. Kashka's amazing presentations. You both honestly left me with like a bevy of knowledge and a lot to ponder with. With that being said, I have the honor and privilege to introduce to you all Dr. Key Alexander. Dr. Alexander is a queer, trans, Black Puerto Rican scholar, educator, and organizer based here in Toronto. They are an assistant professor of gender, sexuality, and trans study in curriculum and pedagogy here at OISE, University of Toronto. Their work and scholarship centers queer Black feminist praxis, Black trans studies, transformative justice, abolition, healing justice. Their current research focus is on pedagogies of abolitionist praxis in the lived experience of Black trans folks. More broadly, their research is interested in mobilizing queer and trans ways of thinking, grounded in their extensive experience as a community organizer. Dr. Alexander views their scholarship as a place to articulate the cultural work they do in relation to their communities. Believing education is a practice of freedom, Dr. Key Alexander strives to center personal transformation and healing in every educational space they have the honor to hold and co-create. Without further delay, it is my pleasure to introduce to you all Dr. Key Alexander.
Hello, everyone. Thank you so much for the wonderful introduction. Thank you so much to my fellow panelists for their amazing work. I'm so glad that you all exist and you're doing this work in the world. And thank you so much for Dr. ABC and the Center for Black Studies and Education for hosting this wonderful event. Thanks so much for kind of giving the lead in. I appreciate it. So I'm going to be talking about some research that's in the early stages. And so I haven't, I haven't written this up yet. I haven't actually gone into the heart of the research yet. So what I'm going to be sharing is the theoretical and methodological framework for my next project, which Dr. ABC shared, which is called Giving Black Trans Life, Creating Spaces for Radical Study in and Beyond the University. So ultimately, this framework that I'm using, both theoretically, epistemologically and methodologically, are really trying to hopefully create a project that disrupts the notion that the relationship between Black trans studies and education is just the study of Black trans people in schools. So I'm arguing that educational research on Black trans life is not only it's not only just to defend the fact that, Black trans people have a right to exist in education spaces, but to acknowledge the ways that Black trans life can serve as a pedagogical encounter that confronts ways of knowing that limit our capacity to, quote, align ourselves across differences in ways that are necessary for social transformation, end quote. That is from Green and Ellison. So I've been working with this conceptualization that I call Black trans life as pedagogical. And it's my primary theorization for mobilizing Black trans ways of knowing in an effort to reimagine what education could be. So to kind of understand this framework, one has to first understand the relationship between education and carcerality. So a lot of my work is trying to make these connections more apparent, to think about, sometimes when I talk about abolition, I talk about Black trans life, people are like, how are they related? And especially particularly in the context of education. So I've been really trying to think through the relationship between education and carcerality. So oftentimes education is kind of positioned as this solution to incarceration, right? We've seen a lot of slogans like, more schools, less prisons, education, not incarceration, those types of things. But what it does is that it kind of creates education and carcerality within this kind of like binary opposite, right? So you either have education or you're at risk for incarceration. And I just don't think it's that simple. So ultimately, a common phrase that people think about when they're understanding the relationship between carcerality and education is the school to prison pipeline, which is this kind of phenomenon where, people say it's a literal pipeline where, students of color, particularly Black students, queer and trans students, disabled students, are kind of funneled into the prison system. And so that is usually the traditional frame that education research kind of uses to explain the relationship between the schools and prisons. But there are a lot of abolitionist scholars like Erica Miners, David Sojourno, David Stovall, Dylan Rodriguez, who are thinking about abolition in a different way in relation to schools. And they ultimately argue that schools and prisons are interconnected sites of discipline and socialization, right? So instead of thinking that there's a pipeline from schools to prisons, abolitionist educators have argued that schools are in fact a part of the prison industrial complex. They are implicated. They are part of maintaining a culture of carcerality. And so this kind of shows up in a lot of different ways. Some of that being there's this kind of criminalization of certain communities and certain people creates a rationale for imprisonment, right? When we say that there are, Ruthie Gilmore talks about creating a class of criminals, right? Like you always have to, if the prison's going to exist and they're a labor force in a particular way, like an unpaid labor force, that means that there always has to be someone as a criminal to keep bodies there, right? And so because we have this mentality of the kind of criminal, we have kind of taught both in schools and outside of schools that some communities and some people are worthy of criminalization over others. And it kind of rationalizes the point of prisons and says, well, we have to have prisons because what about the bad people, right? But that teaches people that there are always bad people to exist, right? And ultimately, this maintains social hierarchies that are told both inside schools and prisons and within like media and culture at large, right? So when I think about trans studies and education, a lot of time trans studies and education is focused on the fact that trans people exist in schools. I am one of them. And often thinks about identity formation or discrimination against queer and trans youth, and or policy development and how to develop policies to deal with the discrimination that queer and trans youth experience. Most of this research in trans studies and education is primarily in higher education. So it's mostly talking about adults, right? People are over 18. There's some that talks about queer and trans experiences within teacher education as well as in K through 12 education. But a lot of times this is relegated to, particularly when we're talking about young people, like young people, primary, middle school, young people. It's often kind of a teacher is like, oh no, I have a trans kid in my class. What do I do? Right. And it often becomes about that, and that somehow trans inclusion or advocacy for trans people only exists if there's a trans student in your classroom, right? When there are actually ways that you can be trans inclusive, regardless of the gender of the students who are in your room, right? So thinking about, for me, it makes me say that when we think about the relationship between trans studies and education, we have to think beyond schools, right? And thinking about how trans studies can be used as a tool to question, trouble, and imagine how gender functions in our society differently, right? I think sometimes people assume that this is an idea that we want everybody to think about gender the way that trans people think about gender, which isn't the case. And I would also say is probably impossible because lived experience and embodied knowledge is a real thing, right? So part of it is that we live in a society that has taught us to criminalize people who decide to do their genders differently, right? People who decide to um, push up against gender norms or question why, gender functions in the way it does, right? So I think what the power of trans studies can offer education research is to really think about school outside of, or education outside of simply school context. So if we think about education beyond carceral schooling, the reality is that if we take seriously what abolitionist scholars have said around the fact that schools are part of the greater prison industrial complex, then that means that when we limit our education research to only be existed in schools, that means that carries carceral epistemologies, right? And carceral ways of thinking about what education is supposed to be. So if we trust that, then how do we also move away from thinking about education research as only being the study of schools or the study of policy around schools, and really think about what Bell Hooks says is education as a practice of freedom? How are we using education as a tool to actually change and uplift our communities? So abolition is often brought up in education research as a response to reform, school reform particularly, and particularly in the context of addressing the school to prison pipeline. So when I started graduate school, I had been doing kind of abolitionist community education, transformative justice work on a kind of community organizing level for a long time. And I thought that I would go to grad school and I would think about how to use those kind of community approaches inside schools. And then, the literature that you jump into is that school to prison pipeline stuff. And then when I started reading abolitionists, it was like, oh, that's only one part of the story. Abolition can't just be, oh, the school to prison pipeline exists. We just don't want to stop sending Black kids to jail. So now we'll consider abolition. But to really take abolition seriously, we actually have to think about that larger context that create the conditions for prisons and for schools to exist within the school to prison nexus. So I try to think about this project ultimately is really trying to think about what is possible when trans studies and education has an abolitionist orientation, right? So that brings me to really, I started to develop my ideas around what a Black trans methodology in education could be. So this theorization that comes from some of the previous work that I've done. That's this concept that Black trans life is inherently pedagogical, that Black trans people are living and being in ways that are instructive to other people, regardless of their identity, and teaches them how to be in the world differently. There's lots of ways in which Black trans existence has been rendered impossible, right? I've been in many settings where people say, Black trans people aren't a real thing, like transness is for white people, or or that like yeah, that like or that Black folks have other things to worry about besides the things that concern Black trans life, right? But I really do think that there's a ways that Black trans people have figured out how to survive, resist, and refuse the carceral state that is actually beneficial to other people and other communities. So I think of Black trans life as a kind of model for confronting carcerality and practicing an abolitionist practice, both in schools and in community in general. So for me, when I think about the kind of essential elements of what a Black trans methodology could have, I have kind of three major tenets that I think should exist in anything that kind of calls itself as Black trans methodology. And again, I'm not trying to say this is the Black trans methodology. I think it's a way to think about studying differently. It's about methodology is about how we study something, right? And so I think it's just offering a framework for thinking about studying in alternative ways. So those three elements are, one is analyzing race and gender simultaneously. So I think a lot of times we have these conversations, especially when people started to learn what intersectionality was, we're thinking about, oh, that's a way that race and gender can come into contact. But even something like intersectionality kind of, I think people have thought that they're really about identities, but they're actually about systems, right? It's actually about how, in the examples that, Kimberly Crenshaw used, she talks about racism and misogyny, how they function at the same time, and how that particularly impacts Black women in a way that it doesn't impact other types of women, right? But it's not just about people experiencing sexism or racism. There is also something to be said about the relationship between race and gender, particularly in a place like Turtle Island that has a history of chattel slavery, right? So there is something to be said about how, yeah, gender is always racialized and race is always gendered. And so if we have an analysis that looks at those two things together, it kind of gives us a different way to see the problem that we're approaching. The second tenet is to recognize that trans life is a site of knowledge production, right? So there are lots of ways in which I mentioned this a little bit earlier, that like Black trans life is often rendered impossible, right? That it is impossible to, live as a trans person and have like a healthy, quote unquote, normal life, right? I think there's ways in which when Black transness is invoked, it's often around the violence we experience in our community. It's often around our deaths. And I think that moving a focus to talk about trans life allows us to kind of think about, okay, there have been people who survived. There have been people who, in fact, thrived. What have they done? What have the things that they've learned from their embodied experience of being in the world, right? That is a form of knowledge production. It's not just about ideas, it's about people having real life experiences that kind of teach them. And some of my previous work is really thinking about the everydayness of how people are learning something like abolition, right? What are the everyday things that happen that actually kind of become a teachable moment for people? So when we think about trans life as a site of knowledge production, there are regular, everyday things that Black trans people do that actually become teachable moments to teach people how to be in the world differently. And that kind of connects to the last point, which is that trans experiences are instructive to others, right? It can be a way to demonstrate challenging something that is thought of as immutable, right? So Angela Davis has this great quote where she says, you know, trans people have taught us to question the gender binary, something that we have always been taught that it is fixed, it will never change, it is a binary, it'll always be that. And trans people have helped challenge that and change that. And so if they've helped us really think through something like gender that's not as immutable, then it can surely help us think about how prisons don't have to be there either, right? And a lot of times it comes down to people imagining, oh, we can't imagine a world without prisons because everything we know kind of rationalizes their existence. And so when trans people have experiences that literally like just, you know, the idea that, you know, gender cannot shift or gender will always be a stabilized concept, like I'm a living example of how that's not exactly true. So when you have embodied experiences, it can teach other people about that, whether they share that identity or not. So those are the three tenets, the kind of analyzing race and gender simultaneously, recognizing trans life as a site of knowledge production, and understanding trans experiences as instructive to others. And so my hope is that an approach to methodology like this aims to transform how education is studied and practiced, and emphasizes the value of kind of like everyday quotidian moments that can become teachable moments. And the last thing is kind of thinking about the pedagogical potential of Black trans life, as I call it. And basically, I think it's, like I said before, it's not just a framework that uplifts Black trans people, but also has us question the very nature of teaching and learning as we know it to be. And the methodology can encourage building the capacity of the next generation of not only trans and Black trans educators, but educators more broadly to kind of think about using the everyday as teachable moments, right? Teachers talk about that all the time, right? What's a teachable moment? You have this moment of tension, you have this moment where you can make it a lesson. It could be something that can turn valuable. And what would it look like if we turned our education research to start looking at those things? And then it kind of, again, shares the importance of an abolitionist praxis and how a trans studies lens with an abolitionist orientation can challenge carcerality in education and society more broadly, and express the possibilities of a new trans studies for education to push the limits of education as a discipline. So that is the framework that I'm using, and I'll just quickly talk about the aims of the project to wrap up. But basically, I have these three research questions for this project. And the first one is, if Black trans life is pedagogical, what are its lessons? The second one is, what can be learned from creating spaces that mobilize Black trans ways of reading, knowing, and being? And the last one is, what becomes possible through the collective experiences of these spaces, and what does that teach us about the nature of teaching and learning? And so I'm basically trying to think about the everydayness of Black trans life and how it offers lessons to build a more liberatory world. And the study grounds itself in the phenomenon of Black trans life as a pedagogical tool for creating life-affirming, world-making educational practices. The hope is to better understand the pedagogical potential of Black trans life, and the spaces that are grounded in mobilizing those ways of knowing. So I'll be kind of visiting spaces that exist in universities but are not connected to classrooms, that are trying to mobilize queer and trans ways of knowing to see if particularly Black trans methods of reading, knowing, and being are showing up in those places or not. Hopefully to develop a lab that is grounded in Black trans praxis here at OAC. And the research hopes to they're understanding that the university has done like there are very few spaces in the university that explicitly work to disrupt traditional modes of knowledge production, right? A lot of the academy is built to reproduce itself. So the hope of the research is to study how Black trans life might manifest in these spaces, how these manifestations contribute to unlearning carceral logics that define academic institutions, and how those insights might transform our fundamental understandings of education as a process and a discipline. And the hope is to, by centering Black trans knowledges and histories, to mobilize a framework to read Black trans life as a portal or an opening to infinite possibilities for self-determination. And I argue that those ways of knowing can be used in educational research to, one, challenge carceral logics embedded in pedagogical practices, two, resist white colonial constructions of identity formation, and three, can create alternative modes of study that fundamentally reconceptualize education as a process and a discipline, moving away from what Professor Eve Tuck talks about as a damage-centered research. This project hopes to advance life-affirming inquiry about Black trans communities. So thank you very much.
My God. Yes, 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 yes. I am full. You know, I'm gonna say something, and I say this of Key, maybe the first you ever heard me say, because we're in different spaces in the building often. But I always say I show up to spaces full. That's something about me. I do a lot of speaking. I show up to spaces full. I work on myself to how I show up in spaces. And when I leave spaces, what I think a lot of persons have asked me to explain, when I leave space, I leave full. There are oftentimes I leave empty because I poured so much. But I also realize when I show up in community, I leave full. People say to me, how do you do it? It's now 7:42 and I'm not exaggerating. What I just got from you and Stephanie and Kashka, I am full. I'm gonna have my dinner, but I'm full. Like I am energized. And some things you said, Key, I have to underline. You must see on my note. I'm taking note, but you see, I put this line there because when you talk about the everydayness, something hit me with that. And I said, I hope Key didn't just say it and pass it. And then you went back to it. So I know you are intentional about the everydayness, the teachable moment. What are the things that trans people do on a every day that makes us understand that you belong here? You are not something to be put on a shelf to admire, like, oh wow, there's that one trans person, wow. And so I love that powerful part of the work, the everydayness, and of course the pushing against what you call carceral logic, because I do a lot of conversation about colonial logic, the ways in which we have explained away colonialism to be the standard. And so you just talk about not reproducing what the institution expects us to reproduce. Stephanie was absolutely clear, unapologetic, absolutely clear about that. And then the work that I'm doing with the work that Kashka and myself is doing, where we're showing up as our authentic self. And what does that look like? Because your authentic self is going to be in some form of opposition to what the standard is in the building. And so sometimes I think why I love this space tonight so much, and I wanted to share with our students, is that I know our students struggle with want to be their authentic self. They want to know how to do that in their research and how to show up in a building at the same time in an institutionalized space. And it takes knowing self. If there's one thing all of us have walk away from tonight, listen to Key, listen to Kashka, listen to Stephanie, is to realize that these are researchers who have worked on self. Yolanda Celia Ruiz talk about the archaeology of self. You have to work on self. Knowing who you are makes you, as a Black author, a Black researcher, you walk taller, you walk stronger. Like Maya Angelou, the curve in your back, the way your hip stand. It's different because it's who you are in all your authentic self. I just want to say thanks. Thanks to you, Kashka. I'm going to have you join us in here. I'm going to add you back. I'm going to add back Stephanie as well. I saw your beautiful, beautiful, beautiful little one join you on screen. I saw people in the chat box loving up on all of that. The presence of Black future is always something that I think we admire and don't even realize how powerful it is when we bring joy. I just want to say thank you. The center is growing. The center is being established. You will remember this 10 years from now, that when the center started, people like you poured into the center. And I mean that from my heart, because a lot of persons don't understand, for a center, for the CBSE to be what it is being and for what it is gonna be, it is community that's pouring into it. I am honored and privileged to be the director of that center. And we know that when we get our kind of center, we don't get the big funds. There's no $1 million in the center. There's no endowment fund. There's nothing yet. But it's gonna happen. And it's gonna happen in powerful ways because people like you show up and you pour into the center, and the center is alive. I want to say thank you, thank you, thank you. And I want to say hats off to people in the community that I see. I see you, Dr. Alana Butler. I see you, Power Woman. I see you, Professor Mary Reed. I see you, Professor Mary Green. I see you, Professor Monique Hibbert. I see you and I know you and the way you walk in the community. And I was going to say thanks. I see our students. I see PhD and master students from other institutions. I see you, Henry. I see you, Conroy. I see you. I see you. I see TDSB people. I see you in the space. Thank you so much. What an amazing evening. And tomorrow is going to be great. Let me share my screen to show you one thing before you leave, everybody. Tomorrow it's going to be great. Tomorrow we have Professor Joki Wan. We have Professor Linda Ifenu. We are going to hear some good stuff tomorrow. Professor Joki Wan, Professor Linda Ifenu, and of course, Professor Mary Green talking about, it's funny, Professor Mary Green is here. I must tell you, Professor Mary Green, I had maybe 2 persons inbox me and said, wow, you see Professor Mary Green's topic? There was like, I'm coming just for that, And everybody's coming for a different piece. And that's what a buffet is all about. And then if you look at it, you see that coming up for the rest of this year on November the 5th, in person here in the center, we're going to have Professor Dr. Rosalind Hampton speak to us about Black activism building on campus. And also, we're going to have Key coming back again. Key, you're poured in. That's all I have to say, with nothing but respect, mobilizing Black, queer, and trans ways of knowing. And I want to make sure I'm going to try my best, Key, for this December the 3rd, if I remember. And for those of you who are listening to me, all those of you who are listening to me, help me to remember that. I know you know ways of doing that, that we invite our Black trans community to come in to have dinner with us, that even come into the space. I know some Black amazing trans women. I'm going to say to invite them to say, come into the space. Dinner is served, by the way. And you know I don't do pizza and soda. No, I don't. We doing dinner. So on those 2 events, dinner is served. And we're going to live our best life and learning. Thank you for filling our cup tonight. Thank you again, Professor Farron, Professor Watson, and Professor Alexander. Everybody else, thank you. Have a wonderful evening, and I see you all tomorrow, and different people be coming tomorrow as well, and those of you repeating yourself. Enough love, enough love, enough love.